So far, we've already talked a little bit about preaching narrative, first person preaching, but there's a different kind of narrative that is somewhat unique, and that's parables. Let's face it, Jesus loved parables, and so should we. Parables are fantastic. They're fantastic because they're like hidden landmines. You don't know that you're on one until it's too late, and usually it has to do with you. So, when it comes to preaching parables, there's some things that you need to keep in mind so that you can, preach them sensitively to the genre and creatively. And so, what do we need to do when we talk about studying parables? Well, first off, you need to note the literary and the cultural context, right? The parables might be in a line of parables. Jesus may have told several parables in succession. And so, why did he do that? What's the point that he's trying to make? Note also the cultural context when you're studying those parables. What's going on in the culture? What would they know that we wouldn't know? And note how the original listeners would have received it and interpreted that parable. That's really, really crucial and really important. The other thing you want to note is the rhetorical effect that oftentimes Jesus was trying to get across, right? So when he tells the story about how there was a servant who owed his master, 40 denarii. Well, that would be like millions of dollars, and you think nobody would forgive somebody of that much, and that's the point. Or, for instance, notice one of the most famous parables of all time, the parable of the prodigal son. When the younger son went to his father and said, "Hey, I want my share of the inheritance," the original listeners, you would have heard an audible gasp when Jesus told that. No one would do that. That's exactly the point that Jesus is trying to make. It's that shock and awe of the story of the parable that Jesus is trying to get across. So you want to note the rhetorical effect. And then note any explanations that are already provided in the text. Sometimes the biblical author himself gives us insights into what Jesus was talking about when it comes to that parable. So study your parable. Study it well, just like you would any other text. And try to find that subject, complement, that exegetical idea so that you have that main idea that you're trying to get across. Jeff Arthur says that parables preach theology, and they also prompt us to respond to that theology. So what is God saying in that parable, and how does he want us to respond? And so, when you think about parables, think about how your listeners can identify with the characters in the parable. That is ultimately what Jesus was trying to get his listeners to do when he would tell parables. The listeners could identify with the prodigal son or the older son, or the woman who lost the coin. They could identify with the rich man and the man who was like Lazarus, who was outside the gates. So how can you help them to identify? And then when you preach, how can you help them to imagine this scenario, imagine this scene going on? So that's when studying it, that's what you want to keep in mind. Here's some other things to keep in mind when you're actually preaching it. Every parable is different. So there's not really a one-size-fits-all on how to preach parables. Of course, just like narrative messages, you want to take into consideration the characters, the setting, the conflict, the plot, the climax, the resolution. Remember all of that. But walk the listeners through the text and react the same way that the original hearers would have reacted. Just like in narrative preaching, would they have been shocked? Would they have been appeased? Would they have been confused? Are these thoughts that are wrestling in their minds? Right? When Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, you better believe it that the original listeners would have been shocked that Jesus had the Samaritan as the hero of the story. So when you tell the story, make sure that they get that. Make sure they understand that this would have been shocking for them. Sometimes Jesus even left the application open-ended. I don't think we should do that much. I think it's better if we tie the knot for them at the end and show them why this parable is important and what it has to do with their life. But sometimes you may need to leave a parable open-ended. So be sure to use that same tone and that same genre sensitivity and that same technique, whether it's humor or shock or just questioning or comfort.